The UCC has this devotional book called Into the Deep. Into the Deep is the theme all the way through the Synod. So it's the theme for Synod, and this graphic of the tree, and the roots is present through all of that. And this is a lovely collection of devotionals that is written by what is called the Still Speaking Writers Group, which is a collection of clergy throughout the UCC who do these little writings. So I thought it might be interesting. We will have these available next week, for people to take home and do their own devotional thing. But I thought it might be interesting for us in our time together to read through a devotional that's for that day and just have some time to process that in a group, which is kind of a different way of approaching the devotional. So you might be able to do both things, have your individual devotional time and have like a group devotional time. We'll do that, and then of course Nourish will be starting. The Wednesday night event will be starting up during Lent. That won't be for a couple of weeks into Lent, because we have Ash Wednesday, the first Wednesday that kind of launches off Lent. And then during that time for Nourish, we will be joined. A member of this church is part of the Still Speaking Writers Group that has written these devotionals. It's a brand new member, so not a lot of you have met Piwa Lengeni. Piwa joined a few weeks ago with Rob Remmer, who Rob had his kilt on that day, if you remember that. So Piwa has come here, moved here as part of the Tulsa Remote program, and is now living in Tulsa. I'm not sure where they lived before, but they do a lot of work with the UCC. They have been a pastor at a local congregation, and then a part of several different UCC programmatic things. So Piwa is going to preach for us once during Lent, and will also be at that Nourish event a couple of those nights to go over their writings, their specific devotionals that they wrote in here. So we'll have kind of a chance to engage with this in lots of different ways. And Piwa's a lovely, lovely person. You will like meeting Piwa. With that, I turn it over to the illustrious Justin DeMatz.
Yay! Awesome. Thank you. Illustrious. Oh, goodness. It's going like straight to my head. All right. Good morning. I'm glad you all are here. We have one more Revelation class. He's striding back with purpose. What's up? Oh, yeah. Thought you were donating to the cause over here. So we have one more Revelation class today to get through. Remember that first week when we met and I said, I have a lot to get through today. I don't know if I'm going to get through it all. Same today. So I will, because I added a section on the front of this one that I hadn't planned on doing. But as out of our conversations last week, I wanted to do this real quick. But this is week 4. Reading Revelation as a call to community. Last week we read it as nonviolent resistance to tyranny. This kind of builds on that some of those same themes. I asked you to read Revelation 21 and 22. I hope you had a chance. Especially we're going to be really focused on Revelation 21 today. When I sat down and wrote this, that's kind of where a lot of my focus went. So I'm excited. We're going to dig into Revelation 21 like we haven't done yet in this class yet, through these first 3 weeks. So, but before we do that, I've been sitting and thinking about our conversation last week, especially at the end when Julie brought up the point about Christology and high Christologies and low Christologies. Number one, I asked Tabitha to get like a very informal survey. I was like, do you know what high and low Christology means? She said, not a clue.
I asked for help, and he was like, nope.
But she brought up a good point about, we'll talk about what high and low Christologies are and what Christology is in general, real quick, just because I want to highlight that so we're not in the dark. But also, as I thought about what she said a little bit more, I think she's right. I think Revelation has a very high Christology, and it's very easy to lean into that when reading it, and it's kind of what I don't want us to do. So anyway, we're going to do that. So let's talk about Christology. Christology is one of those fancy theological words you take classes on at seminary, and it basically means it's the part of theology that's concerned with who Jesus was and what he did. So if you go to seminary and you take like an entry-level theology class, like Theology 101 or whatever, like one of the earliest sections in that class will be a section on Christology. You'll go through God and then into Jesus, and that section is Christology.
And to be honest, it's not the most interesting topic.
Yeah, well, I love Christology personally, but for some people it's not, It can be very dry, especially if you have a professor who is also a historian and wants to spend a lot of time on the Council of Nicaea and all that stuff. That's where that comes in. So Christology is basically like the theological study of who Jesus was and what his life meant. All right. So under that falls ideas like the resurrection. You'll talk about that in Christology sections. The incarnation, the nature of Christ. So that gets into those debates that they had at Nicaea. Was Jesus fully God, fully man, half God, half man, but two spirits in one? That's what all those early councils were arguing about for years. They were very obsessed with Christology at the beginning of the faith, which makes sense in some ways. But I think you can break Christology down into three big buckets. There are some big words here and then just some explanation. So ontological Christology is the study of who was Jesus, what was his nature. Ontology means like the study of being. So what is the being of Jesus? Functional Christology, this is the good stuff. What do the things Jesus do mean? So the actions he took and the words he said. What do they mean about, what do they say about Jesus? What do they say about God? And then soteriological Christology, this is getting into some of the more high-minded stuff. What meaning did the death and resurrection of Jesus had? So what did it initiate salvation? Was it a political act? Was it an ethical act? So those things. We talked about high and low Christology a little bit last week. Julie brought up this idea of high Christology really infecting Revelation in a lot of ways, and she's right. So high Christology basically means that your starting point for talking about Jesus is the divine Jesus, the Jesus enthroned in heaven. That's your starting point. That's a high Christology. Whereas a low Christology means your starting point for Jesus is the Jesus who lived and that you read about in the Gospels. So where do you start thinking about Jesus and then go from there? That's kind of what that means. And so you understanding that, you can kind of get at what Julie was meaning here when she brought up that point last week. Many progressives, it will not surprise you to learn, you probably feel this way, have a low Christology. We start there. We prefer to start with Jesus the man, Jesus the person who did justice and acted ethically in the world, and then build a Christology out on top of that. So we put a lot of emphasis on who he was in order to get at what he meant. High Christologies, on the other hand, I originally was going to say is the more conservative spot, but I don't think that's right. It's the more orthodox way of thinking. The Eastern Orthodox Church, the Catholic Church, large parts of the Lutheran Church, the Episcopal Church that I came out of have very high Christologies. They do start with that divine Jesus and then reason from there. It is found in more conservative churches as well. Like they will have a very high emphasis on it. And the book of Revelation does have a high Christology. The Jesus we encounter in there is enthroned. At some points is depicted as a king or as a warrior. Even the Lamb we talked about last week a little bit. The Lamb is up above everything, like monitoring what's going on. Now we're trying to undo some of that reading through these 4 weeks. We're trying to read more of a low Christology into Revelation. But it's undeniable that a high Christology prevails in Revelation. Tim, let me get you the mic.
So I think one of the challenges, though, is that let me start off this way. The low Christology is like the historical Jesus. Mm-hmm. So that's much more, as much as we can make it, based in reality.
Yeah.
Whereas the high Christology, it's almost whatever you can imagine.
Yeah.
So that to me has always been the challenge, is like, so I can make Christ, in some ways it's good, but it can be used, poorly. You can make Christ, in the Christ of faith, into whatever you want.
Yeah.
So to
Yeah.
me, that's always the real danger, and that's why I guess I've always had a problem with some of the high Christology in the book of Revelation. And if you think about, like if you think of Johannine, like the Gospel of John, in the beginning was
Yeah.
the Word was God. So, pre-existent Christ, and there's all that can kind of be helpful to faith, but it's really open to all sorts of, well, I guess I would almost think of perversions that get so far away. I think that's why progressives are where we're at.
Yeah, I think you're right. I'm glad you brought up John, because I was thinking about that this morning, actually. The Gospel of John is definitely a high Christology gospel. It starts with Jesus. In the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God. That's a high Christology, whereas the Gospel of Mark is more of a low Christology. You don't really get into any like divine images of Jesus for a while in that gospel. Cards on the table, I have more of a high Christology personally. I grew up Lutheran. I spent a long time in the Episcopal Church. So like that's how my mind works. And Julie's right to point it out that she could see some of that and I see that when I do it. But I've always, like, my emphasis throughout my adult life has been trying to get myself into more of a low Christology space, because I do think it has a lot of good. But I do want to, I don't want to say like one is good and one is bad. They're just different. They're different ways to think about Jesus. What's good or what's bad about them is what they spur us on to do or say, or the ethics they give us. Because there are a lot of people in the Episcopal churches, the Catholic churches, the Orthodox churches that have high Christologies, and that leads them to a very progressive or justice-oriented space. And there are a lot of people with low Christologies, like for instance, the Assemblies of God Church has a very low Christology area. The Assembly of God, Church of God in Christ, those kinds of things. They talk about a divine Christ, but they very much are grounded in like the Gospels with the way they think about Jesus. And it doesn't necessarily lead to the ethical and theological outcomes we would want. So there's not a good and a bad here. There's two different ones. But I do think, I agree with Tim in some ways. I think that high Christology has more of a tendency, from our perspective, to lead to bad outcomes.
Sometimes just bad theology.
Or just bad theology. To reason from a place of high Christology, just to verbalize it, because I may be the only person in the room who is that way. Like, starting point is, for me, is thinking about the cross and Jesus on the cross, and the fact that Jesus died and was resurrected 3 days later. That's kind of where I start building out from. What does that mean about Jesus? If Jesus died and was resurrected, then all those things he said and did in his life have different meaning for me than they would if he just died. That's kind of where my high Christology goes. I don't start with an enthroned Jesus. I'm not really interested in that.
The resurrection, I think, where we get wrong is crossing about Paul is a Pharisee. So for them, the resurrection was just not individual. It's this first fruits that Jesus is just the start of the resurrection. So it's not a singular resurrection. So that whole resurrection is a whole cosmic sort of thing. And that's primarily what I think Revelations is about. It's a cosmic imagination of, and I think, if you're being persecuted, gosh, don't you want to know that it all works out in the end, that God wins?
Yeah. And then, we could get into a conversation on the meaning of the resurrection and stuff. I think that's a whole different class. Like, your mileage may vary. I have a very high view of the resurrection. I take it as what it is, but I didn't for a long time. But you're right. Like when we talked about that in the Romans class back in the spring, that Paul has this very high emphasis on participation, that we participate in the life and death of Christ. And that is a big part of things. So what I do want to say is that in Revelation, there is a way to read a lower Christology into Revelation, and that's been some of what we've been trying to do. Like last week when we put Revelation next to the book of Luke up here, it's trying to take this, that is, the words from the kingly court speaking to John, and all these things, and try to read into it the actual words of Jesus as he embarked on his ministry, and to see that you can find those hints in there, and we can find those tones in resurrection that lead us or that speak to us from a point of low Christology. That said, it's not been obviously a focus of mine even until this week when Julie really set my mind thinking about it. So I don't want to spend too long on this. This is like some deep theological weeds, but I did want to kind of clear that up a little bit, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that may have arisen as a result of this before we dive into Revelation itself. Questions, thoughts? Completely confused and lost and gone? Okay, good. All right. So let's talk about Revelation 21. This is why we're here today. We've come to the end. And if you noticed in Revelation 21, we've come to the end of the images of war and strange creatures and death and destruction. There is a couple verses in there about the lake of fire still being there. We're going to talk about that. But at this point in Revelation, we're up to this image of what John calls a new heaven and a new city, the New Jerusalem. And so I want to look at that vision. I want to go through it. I want to pull out some images. And I want to pull out what it is that John is imagining and why he's imagining this heaven and this city here at the end. To kind of do like we did last week with the four horsemen and get at what's underneath those images. Because it may just seem like a straightforward kind of mystical description of heaven as we maybe kind of think of it. But there's a lot going on in Revelation 21 and 22. And it's kind of the culmination of this entire apocalyptic text. This is what John has been getting us towards this entire time. So if you remember all the way back in the first week, I talked about that what apocalyptic literature is trying to do is to get us to see the world around us and the things happening in the world in a new and different way. We're trying to kind of turn it upside down or turn it around and see the back of it. And so John uses these strange images and these strange depictions to do that, to get at the different parts of the world. So we talked about that in relation to what John was doing with the emperor at the time, Domitian, and the destruction of the temple, and the looming presence of the Emperor Nero in his return, and how John was kind of trying to take some of those ideas that were giving people anxiety, that were kind of sapping the hope out of them, and turn those around to give them a different image of it. That's what this is the culmination of. The new heaven and the new city kind of is John's promise towards his readers of a hopeful future, of a better future, even in the midst of everything that's going on. So John's trying to get us to see the world as it could be with this image, as it could be if we all took seriously that call of Jesus to love your enemies and live with compassion and practice justice and mercy and all those things. Jeremy Duncan, the book I keep coming back to in Upside Down Apocalypse, talks about in here that John 21 is the writer creating what he calls an imaginative space for us to contemplate a better world. So if we think about this description of the heaven and the city here as a space you can enter into to kind of imagine a world that could be better to contemplate. It lets you put aside all the terribleness around you and the hopelessness that you may feel around you and imagine something better. All right. And crucially, again, and I think Revelation 21 really makes this point strongly for us, Revelation is not a vision of God destroying the world and killing a bunch of people and putting a few people in heaven. Like we talked about last week with the horsemen, we have this vision of the things that we've done to each other, our worst impulses, doing damage to the world, and God trying to make something better of that. And so we're going to pull that out here in these verses themselves. Any questions or thoughts? Because I'm going to get off the slides.
This just reminds me of in Handel's Messiah from the Hallelujah chorus. It's one of the sections taken directly from the book of Revelation. And if you look at the words, it talks about the kingdom of this world has become the kingdom of God. And it kind of harkens back to this, I guess, a new kingdom of God.
Yeah.
And there's another section about the dead rising and all that too. So
I did. I don't know why I'm not getting it on
Anyway.
both screens today.
not exactly, on topic, but
Very insightful of you. See, you had to take a pause.
No, yeah, I needed somebody to talk there for me. No, I think you're right. And this verse says like God is making all things new. I'm trying to find where that is because it's on here somewhere. See, I'm making all things new. Not necessarily a destruction. You don't make destroyed things new. You make things that are there new. I don't know Handel's Messiah very well. I'm glad you brought that up. I'm not the most musical of people. If you haven't learned that about me, I'm not a very musical person. I don't know if anybody's learned that about me. The poor kids, we don't get any music down in our week because I don't sing. So I wanted to pull up the actual text so we can look at it and spend some time here with it because this is, instead of slides, this is kind of where we'll be. There's like 4 key points that I want to pull out of this text. 4 key images that kind of make up what John is doing here with this new city and this new heaven at the end. So we're going to go through this. First and foremost, one of the points that I tried to make last week, I don't know how well I've been making it, but I've been trying to make, is that one of the things John is doing here is trying to describe this expanding scope of God's love for people. So it started with, in the story of the Bible, it started with the Jews and through Moses, and then that love expanded out, especially through Jesus, and then the disciples to the Gentiles, and then eventually to the whole world. This spreading of the idea that God was just for the people of Israel, spreading out to say God is for everybody, for all the people. And I think John is trying to do some of that here. And he does that through envisioning this new city through a combination of images that are both specifically Jewish and some images that are not Jewish, to kind of paint the picture of this city as not just something within that Jewish tradition or not just within a Gentile or a Greek tradition, but as a city for all peoples to come and worship in and live in. So if you remember, we talked about way back in week 1 that when John was writing the Revelation, he was writing it in the wake of the destruction of the temple at Jerusalem, the end of Palestine, Israel as an independent state, but as just now just a colony or a territory of the Roman Empire. Excuse me. He's writing in the wake of that. He's trying to help his readers make sense of that new reality. And so, obviously, especially for his Jewish readers at the time, there would have been that impulse to kind of turn inward, to kind of bunker down, close the gates, try and find some safety as they see the world like pushing in and destroying them. John doesn't want them to do that. He's not trying to create a sect or this insular, very inward turned faith. He wants them to still be living for the world and out in the world and doing the work that they were called to through Jesus to do for people. So when he paints this picture of the new hopeful world to come, is a picture of a city that is multicultural, to use a term that John would have known, but which we would. And where we see that, you may be going, I don't know where you're getting this from. Starting with verse 2, he calls the city Jerusalem, so we have that allusion to the capital of the Jewish state, to the capital of the Jewish faith, where the temple would have been. So he's very clearly alluding to those Jewish roots. And then if we scroll down here into verse 12, he says, the gates, the city has great high walls with 12 gates, and at the gates are inscribed the names of the 12 tribes of the Israelites. So right there, like on the city gates, as you enter into this new city, you're going to see the names: Judah, Simeon, Benjamin, all these Jewish names, very associated with that Jewish faith that John came out of and that probably many of his readers were grounded in. But then, in verse 14, we get told, and the wall of the city has 12 foundations, and on them are 12 names of the 12 apostles of the Lamb. So on the foundations that the city is built upon, now we're getting into this Christian era. We have the 12 apostles, John, Paul, or Peter, I can't say the names here, those guys. So we've taken that Jewish city and expanded it just a little bit into what at the time was still a Jewish sect, was still considered a part of Judaism in some ways. And then he kind of pulls it out even further. This is the part Tabitha's going to get really excited about because she likes rocks a lot. She likes rocks.
She likes rocks.
She loves rocks. You guys may not know this about us. Our regular vacations, like we're planning one for spring break in 3 weeks, is we drive to Arkansas and we dig for rocks. That's what we do. And we camp. And if you come to our house, our garage is full of rocks that Tabitha and I have dug out of the ground. I don't know what we're going to do with these rocks. They're just in our house.
Just in case.
Just in case. If the world ends and quartz becomes the future currency of a post-apocalyptic world, we're the people you want to hang out with. Because we have a lot of quartz in our garage. So, yes. So we had that.
I had an extra bag on vacation last summer just for rocks.
So we start with this very Jewish city, named Jerusalem, the names of the 12 tribes. We get this Christian edition, the foundations with the name of the apostles. Then we get down further here, and in verse 19 and 20, we get this long section, again talking about the foundation. It says, the foundations of the wall of the city are adorned with every jewel. The first was jasper, the second sapphire, the third agate, the fourth emerald, the fifth onyx, the sixth carnelian, the seventh chrysolite, the eighth beryl, the ninth topaz, the 10th chrysoprase, is that how you say it? Chrysoprase? The 11th hyacinth, and the 12th amethyst. So these 12 stones that are also embedded into the foundations of this city. Does anyone know what those 12 stones in that specific order reference? I didn't know this until I did some research on
No,
this.
you're going to tell us.
No, I'm not.
Yeah.
We're moving on.
2 or 3 of them, I have no idea what they are.
Yeah, there were some I didn't know either. They have other names. So Tabitha, for instance, pointed out, is it chrysoprase or chrysolite?
Chrysoprase.
Chrysoprase is, we know it as peridot.
Is what?
Peridot.
What about jasper?
What?
If I had to guess, I'm thinking platinum.
You're on the right track.
What?
What were you going to say? Were you gonna
Jasper?
Jasper,
It's a very red or orange stone.
yeah, is jasper and garnet the same thing, or are they different? They're different. Okay, so,
And chrysolite is actually,
I know, I read it too, I can't remember now. Chrysolite is something else as well that we, like, is very common.
my brain went blank. I took a
That's right. So, what these 12 stones are, in this order, is in ancient Greek thought, in their zodiac, the one we get the zodiacs from, Aries, Taurus, Leo, these are the 12 stones associated with those 12 zodiacs. So we have this Jewish center, then we get this Christian edition, and then we get this Greek reference here to the Greek mythology. That would have been Greek myths.
Makes sense.
Which,
Context of the time.
yeah, which to John would have signaled, or would have signaled the rest of the world, the Greco-Roman world. As far as John and his readers knew, the Romans ruled the entire world. So we've expanded out. The city is not just made up of its Jewish roots or its Christian roots, it's for everybody. It has these images from the Greek zodiac in there.
Have to do with Zoroastrianism.
Zoroastrianism. I didn't read anything that said there was any references to that. So Zoroastrianism would have been a Persian religion in the East. Yeah, that's a good question. I didn't read anything referencing it. Zoroastrianism had this very strong duality between light and dark at the center of it. Their god was Ahura Mazda, and the Ahura Mazda was in this long-running eternal battle against dark. Ahura Mazda was the god of light. And there are definitely like images of light and darkness through here. We get a lot of times where he says that the wall is built of jasper, while the city is pure gold, clear as glass, so letting in that light.
But there's a lot of, in that world, there's a lot of syncretism where you get crossovers from one religion to another and are blended together and borrow from each other a lot.
Yeah, for sure. And there was especially John is more associated with this Gnostic Christianity at the time, and Gnosticism was very influenced by Neoplatonism and Zoroastrianism, this light and dark duality. That was a big part of Gnostic texts. You looked up rocks.
I did. Chrysolite is the peridot, and then hyacinth is what we call cubic zirconia.
What is?
Hyacinth,
Hyacinth?
this one, number 11, hyacinth, would be cubic zirconia.
So
Fake dye.
birthstones, essentially.
Yeah. So, and they don't exactly map onto birthstones because we're missing pearl and we're missing a few others, but this is where they come from.
It does mention
On the
pearl.
12 gates.
Yeah, pearl is on the 12 gates.
Yeah.
But, yeah, so I thought that was really interesting. When I read that, I was like, whoa, that's crazy. It's the Greek. It's the Greek.
Can I
One more rock thing.
one more rock thing? When I was listing off all of these and finding their like common like present day references, in my wonderful world of like believing in energies coming from stones and things like that, if you go through and look at each one and their stone meanings, a lot of them, like one represents fertility, one represents love, one represents strength, one represents like self-positive self-esteem. And so they, if you look at all 12 of them and then add in pearl, which is strength and purity, you really like are morals that you would base yourself upon. Like, hey, like I want to be strong, I want to be positive, I want to be healthy, I want to be happy, I want to be in love. And
Yeah.
it's all of the, like each of those stones represent what a little component of what would make a good character.
Yeah.
It's very interesting.
Yeah, so the stones all having different meaning. I'm going to undo some of that here in just a minute. I'm sorry to say, but I was so proud last night. I was watching TV, and I got done watching TV, and I went down to the bedroom to go to bed, and she's laying in bed with like the Bible verses out, and I was like, wow, look at this. Reading Revelation at 11:30 at night. What have I done? All right. So you get where we're going here, though. We've got all these images that bring in all these different, what John would have considered the entire world into this city. So it's not just a Jewish city. It's not just a Christian city. This new city is a city for everybody. Then that gets reiterated. If we go down a little bit further, verse 25 here is the one I really like. We had those gates that the names of the 12 tribes are written on. But John tells us its gates will never be shut by day, and there will be no night there. So there are gates on these 12, there's 12 gates on this city, but it says they'll never be shut. This is not a city that's closing its walls to people on the outside and keeping its people on the inside. Its gates are open. Anybody is free to come in here. So kind of emphasizing that same idea that we got from up here with the stones. But in verse 27, he says, but nothing unclean will enter it, nor anyone who practices abomination or falsehood, but only those who are written in the Lamb's Book of Life. This is one of those verses that's very often like, oh man, this is Revelation added again, saying who's in and who's out. But we have to think about verse 27 in relation to verse 25. Nobody practicing these bad things is coming in, but the gates aren't closed to them. The gates are open. So to me, what this referenced to me as soon as I read that was one of my favorite books. I don't know if you read this. C.S. Lewis's The Great Divorce. I love The Great Divorce. We may do a book study on this at some point here at the church because this is one of my favorite books in the whole world. The Great Divorce by C.S. Lewis. He of Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe fame. C.S. Lewis was a very profound thinker and theologian. This book is a story. It's a story of a man who gets on a bus, and it's a bus ride from hell to heaven, it turns out. He doesn't realize at the beginning that he's died, but it turns out he has. And it has a lot of linkages to Revelation. It's like a very short version of Dante's Inferno, if you've ever read the Divine Comedy. So bringing in like these different parts of heaven and hell and what they mean and how people are handling the afterlife. I really like this book because C.S. Lewis's vision of heaven is a place with no wall, no like flaming cherubim with a sword keeping people out. Anybody's exclusion from heaven is purely self-chosen. God welcomes in all. It's a universalist reading on heaven, but some people, because he goes through the 7 deadly sins basically, because of their pride, because of their their anger, their hate about certain things, they won't let themselves into the city of heaven. So I think, I'm trying to remember, like, so the narrator encounters one man who's on the bus, and they're going to heaven, and they're talking, and as they drive along, this man slowly talks himself into this cul-de-sac of thought, where he says, well, I don't need to bow to anybody. I don't serve anybody. I'm my own person. Like, I have more pride than that. I'm not gonna let myself be a servant for others. And he ends up getting off the bus and choosing to stay in hell. God doesn't put him there. He's not ready to go to heaven. And C.S. Lewis's point is that anybody can, at any point in all of long eternity, choose to enter heaven at the point that their mind opens up to that. I see hints of that here in 25 and 27, where we have these gates that are open. People are still outside those gates. They're still working through whatever they need to work through. But it's not God excluding them and putting them forever into this lake of fire. Duncan, in Upside Down Apocalypse, I don't necessarily jive with this fully, but talks about the lake as like this purifying force where people choose to burn away the worst parts of themselves to cleanse, to get ready. It's not theology I'm super wild about, but I get the point he's trying to make here. Let me see where I'm at here. So that lake of fire, we talked about that. That's still here. That's the one like kind of discordant note throughout this chapter. Verse 8 says, but for the cowardly, the faithless, the polluted, the murderers, the sexually immoral, the sorcerers, the idolaters, and all liars, their place will be in that lake that burns with fire and sulfur, which is the second death. Duncan does say in his book, he writes, I don't think it's a stretch to hope that this verse describes not a torment for souls, but instead a destination for all those broken identities that can at last be discarded now that God dwells among us. So I like that idea. Let me get you this, Tim.
I'm just trying to think of the context of this. So something very Jewish was the purity codes. And so particularly in 27 and up there, I see kind of hints of the purity codes of the clean, the unclean. And
Yeah.
I don't know, that's to me interesting contrast to Jesus. I think Jesus kind of challenged all those purity codes.
Yeah, for sure.
So that, I don't know, just interesting contrast picking up on.
That's true. And, and John, if he's writing in a Jewish context, is still living with the existence of those purity codes and people wanting to follow them. That was Paul's big thing, was trying to get people to break out of those. So it may have been something John was struggling with as well. We can't, he had that baggage here in writing this, and we have to grapple with that in some ways. All right, two more aspects I want to talk about as we run down on time here. Excuse me. Verse 22. I saw no temple in the city, for its temple is the Lord God the Almighty and the Lamb. Again, if we're thinking about the context in time here, what had just happened? The temple was destroyed in Jerusalem. What did that mean for his Jewish readers? That was a very earth-shattering, faith-rocking kind of thing. The temple is gone. Where are we going to offer sacrifice and pray to God? John is writing an image of the city to come, God's own city in heaven, the perfect city. And what does he say about it? There's no temple. Just like in Jerusalem. There's no temple here either. We don't need a temple. This is another one of those like universalizing verses that when you do that apocalyptic thing and kind of turn it around and think about it, starts, you start thinking like, oh man, here we go, Lord God Almighty and the Lamb on the throne. But I think what John is saying here, or at least what I read into it, is there's nothing between all the people in this city and God. They're walking around in the city, so is God. There's no temple complex. There's no cast of priests and sacrifices that mediate that existence with God. We're just there with God, just there with the slain lamb, all together mixing in the city. So again, I think that gets at this more like universalizing this different image of a city outside of that is traditionally thought of. Julie joined us. She missed out. We talked about Christology at the beginning.
Oh, I'm sorry.
You'll have to watch the video.
I will watch the video.
Because you made me think a lot this week. So I was thinking about it.
We'll have to have another conversation.
Yeah, for sure. Last image I want to close with from here is, we're going to back one more verse, verse 21. A lot of times when you think about, if you're familiar with these verses or with this part of Revelation, you think about this image of this divine city made of all these precious stones. It's this really beautiful place. It's kind of where we get some of our images of heaven. 21 is one of those. And the 12 gates are 12 pearls. Each of the gates is a single pearl, and the street of the city is pure gold, transparent as glass. The street itself is made of gold. The gates are made of pearls. Each gate is a single pearl. I don't know how that works. These foundations are made of these precious stones, referencing the Greek zodiac. The wall is built of jasper. The city is pure gold, clear as glass. We think of this as this mighty grandeur, right? This really beautiful place. To go back to Jeremy Duncan again, he flips that upside down for us again. We talked last week about the horseman that was famine and how that kind of represented economics and this fealty, the way wealth and the use of wealth and the use of money contributes to that destruction and to the terribleness we see around us. John, says Jeremy Duncan, wants us again to take all these images of great wealth and to flip it upside down. So he writes, the city of heaven suggests that everything we have given inordinate value will one day be as insignificant as asphalt. The jewelry and gold we have worked so hard to acquire, now buried underground and trod underfoot. Heaven is an indictment of our fascination with wealth, not a celebration of it. Just one more way our expectations are flipped. So it's not wealth for the sake of dazzlement. If you walk over golden streets, they're going to get dirty and they're going to get worn down and they're going to lose their luster and shine. Jeremy Duncan suggests that what John is saying here is that gold will be of no more value than concrete or gravel. That's not the point of heaven. You're not going there to get rich. And this is pulling on, we're thinking about reading Revelation through Jesus and through that low Christology that we talked about at the beginning of the class. Jesus' admonitions around the rich entering heaven, easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle, reminding us you can't take any of that with you. It turns to dust. When you die, it stays and you go. Again, it's not, the image of the final city is not this victory of wealth. It's this negation of wealth. It's this negation of all this worldly stuff. That's not why we're going there. So we've got, this universalizing from these Jewish images of the city through the Christian images to those Greco-Roman ones, the lack of the temple, the open gates, take or leave the fire, the wind or the purifying fire in the lake outside of the city, and then the wealth being made to be not worth anything. And you kind of start to get this picture we talked about back at the beginning today of this imaginative space where we can imagine a different world. And I don't know for you, I made it explicit here in this last one, but there's hints of Jesus through all those things, through his teachings, and through his actions. So I think that what all these pictures, what John is trying to do here at the end, is to open up that imaginative space, to get us to think in that apocalyptic mind about the things going on in the world, and about the future as it could be. Yeah.
Just a clarification for me.
Yes.
Okay. The John we're talking about here is not the Apostle John, right? It's a different one.
Correct.
Okay. Okay, that's what I thought.
Obviously, we don't know for sure, but this was written late enough. We think that they were probably that there's a chance that the John or the person who wrote this came out of a community centered around John the Apostle, and that gospel, but it's not the exact same John. We're pretty sure, unless he lived to be like 110 years old. Who knows?
Well, I'm still thinking about those rocks as being values. Mm-hmm. So don't you really have a overturning of value? So where gold and all that was valued in the old earth, mm-hmm. the new heaven, you have these fundamental different values like love and all those high things. So, everything's reimagined. It's been turned upside down.
Turned upside down, a world made new, as he said at the beginning of this chapter, all those things. Let me get you the mic over there. I didn't give you the mic last time. I'm gonna get in trouble for that.
So it's really interesting because of the listed jewels that are up there. I can go walk in a creek bed and pick up jasper. I went walking along the Mississippi River and I found agates, chrysoprase, chrysolite, amethyst, beryl, topaz. These are all very common and very what we would call low value today. But if you think about it, like they're recreating this space that's adorned with jewels. Well, who says that that has value other than you? So it's really interesting because you're not seeing mention of like clear quality diamond, but instead cubic zirconia, which what do we do in today's society with cubic zirconia? We turn our nose up at it because it's not valuable. And so I think it's really interesting to look at the fact that like wealth really means nothing. What we see
has
as
the
worthy.
power we give it.
Yes, it really is like, hey, we're saying these are jewels, but they're rocks.
Build a city out of them.
Build a city of rocks. I mean, isn't that what we do? It's interesting to look at how that value has changed.
Yeah. Did you have something, Julie?
Actually, I have a question. Do you know if in that era when that was written, they would have had the capacity to split, to split and polish any of those things, or would they just be as she was just saying?
I think so. I mean, because quartz was the hardest of rocks, and it was used in that way. Tabitha would know better than I would. She's the rock person.
It's actually really interesting because when I was doing my historical deep dive of rocks last night at midnight, because he gave me passages about rocks. So during this time frame, there was no real definition of jasper or agate, or it was just like, hey, these rocks are all orange. They're pretty and orange. These are all jaspers, but actually they weren't really jaspers. Jaspers, biblically speaking, were actually more along the lines of like a smooth quartz that had an orange and pinkish yellow color. And it wasn't until later that like what we see as jasper now, which is a rock that I can walk down to the creek bed and go pick up, is a rock. But then it was really just different varieties of quartzes. And quartzes are actually very easily polished to be shiny. And like they were, I found a reference saying that like the chrysolite, which is the peridot, was actually just a smoky quartz that had like very high iron count. And so it was kind of an orangey brown color, not the green that we associate it with today. And it's really kind of fascinating how the definitions of those quartz crystals have just changed over history.
Yeah, because I mean they wouldn't have been able obviously to investigate like the chemical properties of these or the molecular structure to make sure they're the right one. Go ahead.
I don't know anything about rocks, so that's not what I'm going to talk about.
if
But
this is
I
right.
want to thank you for doing this because I have avoided Revelation because of the stuff. And so this has given me a different perspective and helped me own a little piece of it as opposed to almost shunning it and avoiding it. But it's also been very helpful to see other people and their perspective and why they see certain things the way they do. So I just want to say thank you. This has been very, very, very informative and helpful
I
and
appreciate
meaningful.
that.
So thank you.
I hope it has been. I did it for the same reason. Like I've always been fascinated by Revelation and never knew what to make of it. And doing this class gave me an excuse to dive deep into it and learn something. So I've learned as much, like this is stuff I've learned over the last 4 weeks as much as y'all have. So I really appreciate it. I want to close just with this last chapter, chapter 22, because these are some of my favorite verses in the Bible, the beginning of chapter 22, the last vision. We've been talking about the city and the heaven, and then in chapter 22, John writes, "Then the angel showed me the river of the water of life, bright as crystal, flowing through the throne of God and the Lamb, through the middle of the street of the city. On either side of the river is the tree of life, with its 12 kinds of fruit, producing its fruit each month. And the leaves of the tree are the healing of the nations. Nothing accursed will be found there anymore. And so I really like this. I think about this, like if I want to get preachy, it's like we thought we were looking at a city this whole time, and then all of a sudden we realized it was just a garden, and a river running through it. So I really like that. I think that's a really hopeful image to end on. That's the good kind of apocalypse there. It all just ends up being a big garden with trees and stuff. So I hope this class has been helpful. I tried to make some like theological points, but more than anything, I just wanted to tackle some of Revelation and talk about it and figure out what was in there. And I think we've been able to do that. So thanks for coming. Like Chris said, next week we'll start the Lenten study of Into the Deep. And then later this year, coming here to talk to you, Dr. Warren Carter is going to come talk about early Judaism and some of the myths wound up in it and its relationship to Christianity. Dr. Warren Carter, Phillips Theological Seminary.
I was wondering about the tree of life.
Yeah.
I mean, some of this almost goes back to Genesis, the creation.
Yeah, I think he's trying to evoke the tree of life from Genesis, for sure. So I didn't get into like 12 kinds of fruit and all that stuff, but I'm sure there's lots of meaning there. Now you know, you can go search for it and figure it out. Dr. Warren Carter is at Phillips, teaches history, so he's going to come talk about early Judaism. Dr. Lisa Barnett is going to come at some point this summer and talk about probably her new book on indigenous theologies, and we'll have Jenny back at some point later this year as well. So, and Violet has asked me at some point to do a class on Ecclesiastes, which I'm like working on. We're going to do that at some point later this year. I'm very.
Can you do a class on
Bible
Bible 101?
101. That's
I'm just going to be very transparent. Some of the stuff that we talk about in class, I have to ask Corinthia later because I don't have any idea. I'm just being so, kind of basic, like what is the Bible? How is it divided? I mean, I don't know about anybody else, but I just think sometimes in these classes, we're expecting people to come with knowledge that they don't have.
Yeah.
And everybody may not admit that, but I'm just going to say, I don't know half the time. So is it just in the future maybe kind of Bible 101 or Christianity 101? And I know that's very deep.
No,
but
but
just to give us some grounding in what is this book?
Yeah.
What does it look like? And we can do that on our own, but I think there's some value in the community.
no, like we talked about, it's like I mentioned back in week 1, like there's value in, and probably the best way to do it is to read this stuff together.
For those of us who have not been in seminary or don't know, and there's a few of us that haven't, something to help ground us as we continue on our journey.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's you or
I'll talk to Chris,
or somebody.
and we'll see what we can put together.
I check out when Pete Enns was here. I
Yeah.
listened to
I listened to
podcast
his podcast.
for normal people, and it's interesting how he likes to keep returning and trying to understand, okay, what is the Bible, and
Yeah.
struggle with that. And
Although
it's a reoccurring.
I'm even hearing like a little less like the historical, like the Bible as an artifact, and more like what's in there. Like what are some of these stories? Yeah.
What is it? Why?
Especially, and I could see why like that point would have hit your mind. Like Revelation references so much of what comes before, and even like somebody like like I like have gone to school for this. I do this a lot, and I don't get all those references until I go back and study them. I'm like, oh yeah, that's a reference to Zechariah.
If it's any comfort, a lot of seminary students, there's a lot of stuff that we don't know.
So
I find a lot of value in putting it all in historical context.
yeah,
Like, this is what was going on in the world when this was written, because it makes you understand better why it was worded the way it was, or presented the way it was, or
so much of
that
it.
gives me
Yeah.
more than anything else is putting it in its place in the world and what else was going on in the world. It's not-
So much of it is contextual, and like we think about our speech today, like so many idioms and just like little references that people 2,000 years from now just won't get, and it's the same thing. And so this idea that like you can just pick a Bible, any translation up off the shelf, and just get it is kind of wild. Like you wouldn't do that with I don't know, like a Greek version of the Iliad. Like so, why do we do it with this? So, all right. Well, thank you all for coming and doing this and exploring Revelation. Good luck in the rapture. I hope it goes well for you. So, rock.